I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's from the Bhagavad Gita, tough to pronounce. And it is what went through Robert Oppenheimer's mind when he saw the Trinity test in July 1945 in New Mexico at Alamogordo, when the atomic test was a success and he saw the power of the atomic bomb. There is the result of that test. A month later, August 1945, the first mushroom cloud to be seen really around the world, you might say, at Hiroshima. And why this is such an important and meaningful subject to me personally, and how it's sort of deep into my bones, because it goes deep into my own past. I'm a baby boomer. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and when I was in elementary school, this is what we did. And if anyone listening in may remember this and might want to share a memory of it later, I'd really like to hear it. I'll just say one thing about this. I remember vividly, as if it were 5 minutes ago, my teacher telling us all, when we got under our desks, we had to turn away from the windows, because if a nuclear bomb went off outside, there could be flying glass, and we didn't want it to hit our faces. The idea of a mushroom cloud going off right outside the schoolroom and worrying about flying glass is, of course, a totally absurd idea. But that's what we were told, and that's why you see these kids doing that. So the mushroom cloud is the first image. The image of all of us hiding from it is the second image I want to start with. And the third is none other than the lucky dragon himself, who I hope everybody will recognize immediately as none other than Godzilla, who is the most famous icon from Hollywood that comes out of the Cold War and the atomic age. And he's something of a cult figure, or maybe just a comic figure for some, but you'll see he's a whole lot more than that. Right after Truman, right after the Hiroshima bomb, President Harry Truman came on the radio, did an address to the nation, and he said in terms certainly not as poetic as Robert Oppenheimer gave us, but he said very simply, having found the bomb, we have used it. Kind of dry. He became Time's Man of the Year, and yet if you look at this cover, where is Harry Truman? He's not even the center of attention. Already, Time magazine really understood that, in a sense, the person of the year was maybe Prometheus, the god who gave man fire. And right now, it seems as if Prometheus in 1945 was giving man another source of energy, atomic energy, and it was pretty overwhelming. In 1946, in what was called Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, the U.S. resumed testing. They hadn't tested anything since they dropped the Hiroshima Nagasaki bombs, and this is, in my mind, both, all of the following: awesome, spectacular, beautiful, horrifying. And yet at the time, because we really didn't understand what atomic energy was and what atomic bombs were, for most people, and I asked my parents about this. My father was serving overseas in the Pacific in 1945 when the bomb was dropped, and I asked my mother, what did you think when you heard the news about the bomb? And she said, well, she was excited. My father would be coming home, the war would be over, and she had no idea what atomic power meant. And she learned about it certainly later, as I'll mention. One of the things that the images of the atomic bomb was provoking in people was not fear and outrage, as happened much later, but something else. Maybe one of the other more iconic things out of that time was a Frenchman named Louis Réard, who designed a new swimsuit. And he decided in July of 1946, when he saw the Operation Crossroads test that had happened on Bikini Atoll, he decided, I'm going to call it the bikini, because as he put it, it was something that was going to be, really land like an exciting bomb in the fashion world. And what do we call beautiful women? Bombshells. This connection between the atom bomb and sex is not really hard to put together. I'll quote Henry Kissinger, the longtime diplomat under Richard Nixon. He became Secretary of State. He said in his dry way, in that accent, power is the greatest aphrodisiac. And in fact, this nexus between the atomic age and atom bombs and mushroom clouds and bikinis and sex is really part of understanding the era. And if there's one thing Hollywood knows, is how to exploit that. So one of the early movies that Hollywood came up with was called The Atomic Kid. It's not well known, and it's extraordinary to watch. It's really, in a way, a ridiculous film, a cheap film of the time, Mickey Rooney starring in it. The premise is that Mickey Rooney has accidentally been caught in an atomic test in Nevada, which he survives, but he's irradiated. And it's a comedy. So this is not some sort of a horrible thing, like, oh my gosh, he's got radiation sickness, as happened to everybody in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Instead, he becomes little Andy Rooney, who was just a short guy and not a romantic lead in Hollywood. He becomes sexy. And in fact, he becomes irresistible to this gorgeous bombshell of a nurse who falls in love with him. I mean, he glows literally with radiation. And when she kisses him, his glow just increases. And she says something like, well, I've never been kissed like that before. So Hollywood was having some laughs with this. And it just shows how little understanding people really had of what atomic bombs really were, what atomic power was. And again, we were kind of distanced from things at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unless you maybe read John Hersey's famous book, Hiroshima. Well, everything was great. America had the bomb, and it was the American century. We had won the war. Our economy was doing great. Nobody had dropped any bombs on America after Pearl Harbor. And then, 1948, to Harry Truman's shock, because the American government thought Russia was years away from getting an atomic bomb. But there it was. The USSR had set off a test, and suddenly the fun was over. They had the bomb too. And that kind of changed everything, to say the least. We started preparing for Cold War in a very different way. The preparations for the Cold War was more than just dropping a few test bombs on Bikini Atoll. We began in the early 1950s, a series of tests that were done in the Nevada desert. And these tests were, when you see footage of them, and if you've ever seen the incredibly great documentary movie, The Atomic Cafe, you can see some of that footage. We had some of our troops doing essentially maneuvers out in the desert, and we had these tactical nuclear weapons. They were very low yield weapons, but they were nuclear weapons, and they were spewing nuclear radiation and contaminating the area. And what did we have our troops do? Did we give them fancy lead shields and hide them in bunkers? No, we essentially had them dig trenches, put handkerchiefs over their faces. You'd think this was, COVID-19, put a mask on and you'll be fine. This was nuclear radiation. And then after the bomb went off, the troops were told to climb out of the trench and walk towards the nuclear bomb mushroom cloud. While this may sound crazy, why would we do this? This was how our military was doing maneuvers and practicing for how we thought a real nuclear confrontation with Russia, probably first in Europe, say in Germany, would occur. And, you know, that's how we thought the next war would be fought, with tactical nuclear weapons. Well, Americans still thought these tests were kind of fun. They weren't sure what to make of them, so it became something called nuclear tourism. And you would drive your car out to the desert at 4 in the morning before dawn, and you know, you might bring a 6-pack of beer and your cameras, and it would be really exciting. You would watch the bomb tests go off. America was really into this nuclear culture, again, not quite sure what to make of it. Well, Hollywood decided at this point they really had to start tackling things from a whole lot of different angles. And one of the classic and really great films of the era that is an all-around cautionary tale is The Day the Earth Stood Still. The concept is that Klaatu, played by Michael Rennie, lands in a flying saucer, and he's come to tell Earthlings, he's not a dangerous alien, but Earthlings aren't sure, but he's come to say, you guys have nuclear power now, and we in the galaxy that run things, we believe in peace, and you people on Earth are a threat to the whole galaxy, and so you're going to have to prove that you can get peace on Earth together. And he says, if you threaten to extend your violence, this Earth of yours will be reduced to a burned out cinder. Your choice is simple. Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration. I mean, the idea was the aliens were been watching us. World War II, millions and millions and millions of people died. Now we have nuclear weapons. What are we capable of? Oh, I gotta go backwards, which is, there we go. And a couple years later, a new form of science fiction movie really came about who was a real prototype and a forerunner of Godzilla, the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, who attacks New York. It's a wonderful movie, and it very much was a really something that Godzilla used as a template, not just the monster himself, but the whole plot and so on. In this case, the Beast he comes out of the ice where he's been trapped for millions of years. Nuclear bomb testing has released him. So it's this cautionary tale saying, human beings, if you keep nuclear testing, you're going to stir up nature and you're going to cause trouble. And sure enough, the Beast is himself got radiation sickness, and he's spreading it all over New York as he's tearing down buildings. Hollywood was looking at the nuclear industry in a bunch of different ways, meaning, the nuclear culture in a bunch of different ways. So you had huge monsters, mutants because of nuclear radiation. And you also had, as we saw with Klaatu, aliens coming in from outer space, and they were not all friendly. And in the case of the great classic Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the theme and the concept was really almost in this case, again, a cautionary tale. In this case, the fear is that we might be invaded by the Russians, the communists, not with nuclear bombs, but in some other way, by coming in and snatching our bodies or our souls and turning us into lifeless, sexless, emotionless robots. I mean, that image of the godless atheist communists coming into our country, the enemy from within. These were the themes, the fears of the Cold War, and why we had to, in fact, prepare ourselves and ready ourselves to fight the commies. And of course, the Russians got the bomb ahead of time, in part because the spies, the real Russian spies who shared a lot of that information with the Russian scientists. So it was not an unrealistic fear. Unfortunately, that fear led to panic in many cases, and the terrible legacy of that time includes the arrest and execution of the Rosenbergs. It includes the HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee investigations where people's lives were destroyed because they were hauled up in front of those committees. And then, of course, the McCarthy hearings, the Hollywood 10, who were people who ended up being blacklisted, is a part of this whole story. And you may be familiar with some of this. These were tense and really terrifying times. And if you think of the enemy within, you know, was it Russians that were really the biggest risk, or we really a risk to ourselves? Was it our own culture, our own divided country? And I hate to say that it reflects a little bit of our current situation. You know, who was really the enemy? Those were scary times. Well, you could, again, you know, we had some different themes going on in these Hollywood movies. In the case of The Incredible Shrinking Man, and I picked out movies, there were a lot of really bad science fiction movies in the 50s, some really silly ones, fun to watch if you're a fanatic like me, but there are some really truly great works of art. And the ones I'm citing are, this is another great one. And in this case, an average guy, by accident, is affected by a nuclear radiation cloud. And over a period of months, he starts to shrink. And you know, to the horror of his wife, you know, she sees her husband getting smaller and shorter. He doesn't fit into his clothes. And it gets worse and worse until he finally ends up trapped in the basement. And he's smaller than your average house spider, which he has to fight off in a tremendous scene, one of the most famous scenes of that era. In a battle with the spider, he fends off with one of his wife's sewing needles. This idea of man in the modern age shrinking down, losing his virility, his manhood, his power. These themes are what we were living with in the 50s as we tried to grapple with, you know, the meaning of the atomic age and the modern age, as we were sort of giving up some of our culture was being given up to, you know, you name it, fast food, robotics, you know, a sense that everything in the modern age was fast and furious. And there's a lot of concern, philosophical, religious, about what were we giving up. And these movies were tremendously valuable echoes of that. Now, maybe you got small and, or in other movies like them, radiation caused the insects to get huge. And in another great classic from the time, Them, the reverse happened. And so you have the same situation of a human being shrinking in front of, you know, a giant irradiated monster. And the explanation that was given in the movie, as the scientists brought in to sort this out, you know, puzzled out a little bit. Well, the answer, a fantastic mutation, probably caused by lingering radiation from the first atom bomb, meaning that test in the New Mexico desert, because that's where this film takes place in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo. And it's the consequence of what Sir Robert Oppenheimer, not Sir Robert, but Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was thinking about when he saw that first test. Dr. Harold Medford, not a real scientist, but he plays one, that's the name of the character in the movie Them, says, very philosophically, as you can imagine, when man entered the atomic age, he opened a door into a new world. What we'll eventually find in that new world, nobody can predict. So Hollywood was really getting into the philosophy of all this, and they were really thinking about the enormous implications of what the atomic age meant, and they were tackling it from all sorts of different angles. Comedy, Cold War fears and anxieties, ET aliens, radiation effects. The radiation in the desert, by the way, and there were a lot of tests. I used to have walking around in my head how many bombs were dropped out there. A lot of bombs. And the radiation effects are still being studied today. There are areas you cannot go into. If you go to Alamogordo, you can visit that. And when you go out there, you can, right to the site where the first bomb test was, you can still find something called trinitite, which was formed by when the sand of the desert was lifted up into the air by the enormous power of the atomic blast and the enormous heat. some of that sand fused and fell down to the, back down to the desert and formed this kind of new mineral called trinitite. It's slightly radioactive. So, trinitite actually became famous, and people started selling it, and they started selling phony trinitite, which was probably better to buy, a lot less dangerous. So I mentioned scientists. In The Day the Earth Stood Still, Sam Jaffe plays a scientist. He has a big role. And if you take one look at him, and then you look at the famous picture of the most famous man of the atomic age, perhaps, you can see they weren't accidentally making him look like Dr. Einstein. I mean, it was pretty straightforward with his wild hair and that scientific wonder look. There's Robert Oppenheimer on the lower right, another template for the scientist. He's got those piercing eyes. And there's Robert Medford, the kind of kindly avuncular scientist. There are all these different styles of scientists. And I hate to bring up our times right now, but there's a lot of anxiety about whether the American public trusts scientists. I suppose Dr. Fauci should be in this picture, as he's the most prominent scientist we have on our TV screens these days. And back in the 50s, people sort of revered and couldn't believe the incredible power of the scientific brain could unlock the power of the atom. And yet it made people very anxious. If you think about the most famous mad scientist in all of literary history, is none other than Dr. Frankenstein from Mary Shelley's book and the famous movie of the 1930s. What happens when you release the power of nature? Is it good things for mankind, or is it, if you fool around with power not meant for man, then maybe you're unleashing forces you're going to regret. That's the theme. That's what all these movies were constantly playing on, the themes of that. But there were great efforts by the government to turn that narrative around. President Eisenhower addressed the UN in December 1953, and he launched an initiative he called Atoms for Peace. And he was telling everybody, if we can control the atom, we can control these forces, we can live, the modern age, we can cure all sorts of things. There will be power across the planet. We'll be able to, shrink the globe, as it were, because everybody will be able to have electricity and power, and it won't be power to destroy each other. It'll be power to live, a better life, and we can bring all the advantages of modern civilization to third world nations. That was the promise. And it was felt, scientists were promising that if we continued in our research on nuclear power, in fact, that energy, nuclear energy would provide everybody in their household with energy that was too cheap to meter. You would be able to run your house for like pennies a year, and it wouldn't matter. It would be so easy. That was the promise. Well, how'd that work out? Not so well. Well, things turned around again, and the promise of nuclear age had to hit another milestone. We didn't have atomic bombs only anymore. We had hydrogen bombs, and the release of nuclear power through the hydrogen atom. And hydrogen bombs, by the way, were triggered actually by, this is nuclear fusion from hydrogen triggered by actual fission bombs, the old atom bombs, nuclear uranium bombs. I mean, this was a whole other level of power. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was roughly 15 kilotons. The nuclear bomb that was tested in Castle Bravo was 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful. This was absolutely, when they did the test, when the US did this test back at Bikini Island, essentially wiping out what was left of Bikini Island, we really didn't understand how big the test would be. They thought maybe it would be 5 kilotons. They weren't sure. It turned out to be much bigger than they thought. Now, the US wanted to be responsible, so they sent the word out in the whole area of the South Pacific to all the shipping lanes don't come anywhere within 90 miles of this place. We're going to be doing it, you know, something, don't come anywhere near here. Well, unfortunately, the memo didn't get out to everybody. And there was a small fishing vessel, had about 24 sailors on it, Japanese. All of these sailors were poor fishermen, and they were out there trying to get their catch. They didn't know about any tests coming on. And one morning, as they're out there in, you know, in the hot Pacific pre-dawn hours, a couple of the men on watch on this boat saw an enormous flash of terrifying light on the horizon. And they panicked. They started screaming to their fellow crewmen, "It's a Piccodon, it's a Piccodon." The word Piccodon in Japanese was a nuclear bomb test, and they didn't know what was going on or what to make of it. The whole crew came out of the hold, and everybody came on deck, and they saw this, and they didn't know what to do, and they were very scared. Well, what they did was they started working the fishing day as light dawned, and they went about their business fishing. And about 4 hours after the test, they saw some strange kind of dark clouds coming over towards them. And the next thing they knew, there was this strange gray ash falling as if it was snow, just right on their ship, all over the place. They were engulfed by it. And they had this ash that just covered their ship and the fish that they had been catching and themselves. They had no idea what to do, though. They just hosed off everything the best they could. They spent the next 2 weeks fishing. They went back to port. They sold all their fish into the market. And by then they were starting to all feel pretty sick. And sure enough, they went to the hospital. And the word went out around Japan that a fishing boat, and there were some others, had come in, sold their fish, and the whole crew was sick with radiation sickness. And the next thing you know, everybody's going around the fishing markets in all the ports up and down Japan with Geiger counters, and they're finding that the fish are contaminated. Now, this is 9 years after Hiroshima. Japan is still a poor country recovering from the war. And now its main source of food for the entire population is contaminated with radiation. And the word got out that the emperor that everybody revered was no longer going to be eating fish. The economy of Japan was deeply affected, and there was tremendous panic and anxiety. This turned out to get a small little article in roughly page 20 of the New York Times, this whole incident. But for Japan, it was a major catastrophe. So why did it lead to this? There was a producer, an independent film producer, a Japanese producer, who was so upset about this incident that he decided he wanted to do something about it. So in a matter of a couple, 3 months, he produced on a shoestring budget a film called Gojira, which was the original version of what we know as Godzilla. Audiences went to see it, and they didn't laugh or get excited or think, wow, that was a fun science fiction movie. They came out of the movie in tears because what they saw was a very real allegory. Real not because they believed in monsters so much, but because they saw essentially an allegorical story for the atomic age and for the whole experience of World War II and the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the producer said, mankind had created the bomb, and now nature was going to take revenge on mankind. He understood the themes that Hollywood was already exploring, and that's how Gojira came to be. And this is very much nature taking its revenge on mankind, and it's sort of a mixed sort of sense Japan had for, it had feeling of guilt for having been responsible for starting World War II, and they saw themselves as guilty as perpetrators, but also as victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks, And here you have Godzilla attacking Tokyo. And you can see he's gotten this way because he's been woken up by the atomic bomb testing. You can see the fins on his back are glowing with radiation as he terrorizes and tears up Tokyo. So the Japanese people watched this movie, and what was in their minds was what they had experienced. And here, if you compare the still from the movie on the upper left, Tokyo after Gojira, Godzilla, has laid it to waste, it's exactly what the people had experienced in Hiroshima and after the fire bombings in Tokyo, which were not atomic, but devastated that city. So this was the real deal for them. Now, in America, of course, we didn't suffer any of these things, but we welcomed Godzilla to America 2 years after he was in Tokyo. The movie was completely reorganized by Hollywood. They actually bought the rights. They re-edited the movie, shot a few extra scenes with an American actor, dubbed it in English. And this is what I saw at the age of about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old on TV, and started my lifelong obsession with Godzilla and monster movies. We'll get back to that in a second. There he is, Godzilla, King of the Monsters, starring none other than Raymond Burr, who quickly after this became famous on TV as Perry Mason. Anyone who's old enough to remember Perry Mason, there's just been a reboot of Perry Mason. But there's the original Perry Mason starring in Godzilla. He does a great job narrating the movie and performing in it. So Americans saw this. This was released in theaters first and got universally panned. Everybody thought it was, the critics thought it was idiotic. When I saw it on TV, I thought it was fantastic. It was both scary and exciting and wonderful. That image I showed you of King George, or rather St. George, slaying the dragon. Well, the dragon imagery in mythology is both Western mythology and Eastern mythology. In Western mythology, we think of the dragon as just a scary monster that has to be defeated, by some great hero. But in Eastern culture, dragons are something very different. They are big, powerful, but they also are creatures of great wisdom. And dragons are something that bring, forces to, the Eastern culture that are not all negative. It's a very mixed kind of thing. And so Godzilla has a very different kind of image there. And just to share with you what the nuclear scientists in New Mexico during World War II, when they were trying to work out just how much nuclear energy they needed to create the bomb with the critical mass amount of nuclear fuel they needed, and it was dangerous stuff. They were working with nuclear fuel, and there were accidents, sub-bomb accidents, and they called it tickling the dragon's tail. A great image. Well, Walt Disney Productions, was really working. They really believed in nuclear power, and they worked with the government to tell everybody, don't be afraid of nuclear power. Our friend the atom was the image they wanted us to have, and they produced this fantastic documentary, educational video, which I saw as a kid, and it's worth watching today. You can get it online. It's absolutely terrific. And it included this image of a genie coming out of the bottle in a sort of nuclear mushroom cloud himself. And the symbolism is clear. You can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. We have to get it under control. Here we're still trying to get it under control. Our friend the atom. Was this something the American public was willing to accept? Well, when the American public saw the amount of nuclear testing going on, and this is a chart showing the number of bombs being tested each year. Now, as you get into 1958, these are hydrogen bombs, not in the early days, the atomic bombs. And there was nuclear terrible fear, for good reason, of nuclear fallout spreading around the globe. So people weren't thinking so much about, our friend the atom. They were thinking about, am I feeding my kids milk that is made from cows They were eating grass that were irradiated by nuclear testing full of strontium-90. It was a real thing and a real fear. And of course, we were also afraid of the great kind of, boogeyman of the day, as I grew up thinking that this frightening bald guy, Nikita Khrushchev, was going to, as he said, "We will bury you." He made it on Time magazine. Compare this Time magazine picture with this one. It's a whole different scene. This is meant to make you feel, oh, we found the bomb, we've used it, it's all right, we've got it under control. This image, not so comforting. And what America did as the Cold War really heated up, we started seeing something, not just, possibly nuclear war that we might win or lose. We saw the end of mankind possibly coming. How are we going to handle that? Well, Hollywood's back in the act, and they produced one of the great masterpieces of the Cold War era, On the Beach, starring Gregory Peck in one of his great roles. And if you've never seen it, I urge you to see it. It holds up over time. I've seen it recently. It's really great. And at the end of the movie, when the world, has to deal with what it's done, what it's unleashed, the message is, there's still time, brother. It's not too late. Hollywood's telling us, Hollywood took this really seriously. It's not too late for us to make peace. We can't let, this, be our only reality. We've got to do something about it. And Kennedy, well, he was a cold warrior, and he was trying to deal with being a young president. Khrushchev wasn't taking him seriously. Khrushchev was testing, actually the Russians tested a bomb. The largest bomb ever tested was a 50 megaton bomb, an enormous bomb that, they didn't even know what the power was, the Russians. And this helped launch an era called the bomb shelter era. And again, I was deeply upset about this at the age of 11. When I saw this stuff on TV, there were documentaries, everybody has to build a nuclear fallout shelter. And I went running to my father, "Daddy, what are we going to do? We've got to build a fallout shelter. We've got to build a fallout shelter." I've been hiding under my desk at school already for years. Now, that wasn't going to be enough. Your desk wasn't going to protect you. You needed a fallout shelter. And my father just said, "Son, we're just going to go down into the basement. We'll all be together, and we'll just have to pray for the best." And I wasn't very, very calmed down by that. And the fallout shelter culture was itself an amazing thing and worth. You can study it. It's wonderful to look at some of the old images, the films, the footage of showing people how to build a fallout shelter. Don't forget, lots of canned food, and you need some books, and you're going to need games for the kids to play, and you're going to need a radio, and you're going to need bunk beds, and you're going to need a crank machine which will crank in fresh air into your fallout shelter. They never said anything about where you're going to go to the bathroom. I always kind of wondered about that. I guess you have to ask astronauts. They've got that figured out. Well, Hollywood didn't waste time, and it produced one of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes ever, the original Twilight Zone, known as The Shelter. And the premise is a whole bunch of neighborhood friends are having dinner at someone's house, a dinner party, and suddenly there's news over the radio that the Russians have attacked us, World War III has begun, and everybody rushes home, but only one of those neighbors has built a fallout shelter. It's a little bit like the Three Pigs tale, the pig who built the brick house, and all the other neighbors rush over and they want to get into the shelter. And he's their best friend. He's yelling at them, there's no room in here, and they're trying to break in. Google this, you can see it for free. You can stream it. It's one of the greatest episodes they ever did. Great morality tale. Well, back in the real world, my mother, who in 1945 had no idea what an atomic bomb was, by 1961 she knew, and she knew about strontium-90 in the milk that I was drinking, and she joined a group called Women's Strike for Peace. There was a very robust peace movement at the time, and that's a long and interesting subject on its own. Well, there was a whole culture that was forming around the idea of protest to nuclear war. People didn't want to sit back and just sit in a fallout shelter. And if you survive the, the first wave of the bombs, you come out and, you and your wife and kids would be alive, but everybody else would be dead. So people were starting to think about the consequences of an Armageddon. And Bob Dylan wrote one of the classic protest songs of the era, talking World War III blues. And if you're a Dylan fan like I am, it's actually brilliant and funny. And pull out your old album and throw it on there and listen to it again, or get it on Spotify. And I was having nuclear nightmares. So knowing that Bob Dylan had them too, somehow made me feel I wasn't the only one out there. So here we are trying to deal with this confrontation, with this end in nuclear war. And we had, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the great moment where mankind almost did what Klaatu was warning us not to do, to destroy ourselves and unleash the forces of nature. Basically, it was going to be Godzilla coming to just destroy all of us, metaphorically. Well, what were we going to do about it? Well, Hollywood was thinking about it, and the Cold War, and specifically the risks of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis provoked this very great classic movie called Failsafe, starring Henry Fonda as President of the United States, Walter Matthau in the role of essentially kind of like a Henry Kissinger character. He's a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, and now he's advising the president in the National Security Council. He wants to, see the movie and find out. It's very serious, very disturbing, and one of the most intense endings of a movie ever. And I'll never forget it the first time I saw it. But fortunately, that wasn't the only way to go. And what we needed, along with some humor like Bob Dylan was showing us, we needed Hollywood to come up with something else. And this is certainly not, you could say Hollywood. Stanley Kubrick created the great masterpiece of the Cold War, one of the greatest movies of all time, in my humble opinion, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And I want to bring back just the whole concept of bomb, power, love, bikinis, beautiful blondes in bikinis. And there you see this image of the U.S. president on the left, who's trying to make that red line phone call to his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, who is portrayed as, on the other end of the line, as drunk, and he's there with his girlfriend. I mean, the whole thing is a comic masterpiece as they try and figure out how to save the world in the face of an accidental nuclear war that's about to occur. Well, there's the imagery of the two movies: Henry Fonda as president, the great Peter Sellers as president on the phone with the Russian premier, and there's Kennedy on the phone during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you think about the primary of 2008, when Hillary Clinton had an ad on that said, at 3 a.m., when the telephone rings and the president has to pick up the phone because there's a crisis, who do you want to be, on the other end? She was telling people that Barack Obama did not have the gravitas to handle such a crisis. Anyway, the image came up years later. So here you have an image from Dr. Strangelove, the war room below. There's the president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dealing with the crisis. And above you have the real Kennedy war room with his cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff trying to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we were watching, we saw this as citizens really happening, and then we were seeing it as satire or farce. And there's some old quote, history happens twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Some famous French, I don't know, Moliere or somebody said that. And so that's what we were experiencing, and Hollywood was nice enough to give it to us. personally, it gave me, at the age of then, I was around 14 years old, a way of kind of handling my fears. You know, it gave me the strength to see nuclear power, nuclear war as a kind of a comedy that you could get your hands around it. And there are some more images that will give you a sense of what Kubrick was having fun with. I hope I don't need to tell you who's Henry Kissinger and who's Peter Sellers in the role of Dr. Strangelove. It's no accident that they look like twins. And below, you have General Jack D. Ripper on the left and General Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force and basically the head of our, I think he was head of Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and was basically urging Kennedy to consider just dropping bombs on Cuba and let's get going. I mean, so these are the role models that Stanley Kubrick used for his brilliant satire. Well, fast forward a few more years, and we're finally getting out of the worst of the Cold War. Khrushchev is gone, Kennedy sadly is gone, and we're getting the possibility of détente. In this wonderful movie, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, that's a young Alan Arkin in an all-star cast. And we've gone from farce or satire to a kind of gentler comedy. It's still a bit of a farce, but it's this wonderful story about a Russian submarine trapped off basically a Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, and it's off season, but the interaction of the islanders with the Russian sailors, and it's wonderful. And it ends up with a young Russian sailor, excuse me, and a young, beautiful a teenage American girl, and the two of them, have this little fantasy romance during the movie, and it's the idea of like, let's all come together. This sort of Adam and Eve, Russian and American young people must show the way towards peace and understanding. Fast forward a bit to another seminal moment in the atomic age, and that is the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, which changed everything. So much for the promise of nuclear power providing us free electricity, energy that electricity you would never have to meter, be free. Well, that just didn't work out. And I hardly need to mention, how that freaked everybody out, and then Chernobyl was worse. And then the shock of our more modern time was not a nuclear bomb, but when we saw this, we knew what the possibility was. If terrorists could fly a plane into the World Trade Center, what else could they do? And what if it was nuclear? And revived. We thought we were out of the Cold War was over. There was no more USSR. It was just Russia, and they really weren't threatening us. And we were kind of dealing with nuclear weapons. But now everybody saw maybe it wasn't such a safe place to be, the 21st century. Hollywood didn't want to mess. Hollywood was following all along. They were producing lots and lots of movies now and TV where everything had to do with the terrorists are about to drop a nuclear bomb or set off a nuclear bomb. What are we going to do about it? How do we get them to stop it? Well, we have Jack Bauer in 24, a TV show that gripped the nation. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we have to use torture to get them to tell us where that nuclear bomb is. And that's the only thing that's going to save us. I mean, it roiled our politics and our sense of, a lot of things. Well, as Hollywood was looking at the real world and figuring out how to come out with narratives to entertain us, well, politicians were watching these things and they were seeing what worked in terms of stoking fears. And Condoleezza Rice, as she tried to convince Congress that we had to have a declaration of war to attack Iran, or rather Iraq, because Saddam Hussein surely had nuclear weapons. And some people said, well, does he really? And she said, well, we don't want, they said, we need a smoking gun evidence to be sure that he has real weapons of mass destruction. She said, well, we don't want the smoking gun to turn into a mushroom cloud. the image of the mushroom cloud, which we've been carrying with us all those years out of Hiroshima, the Bikini Atoll tests, the tests in Nevada, the nuclear hydrogen tests, which were more scary than anything else, Cuban Missile Crisis, and all the way through. And she knew how to tap into America's deepest fears, and she went right there. Fast forward a little more, and we get the Fukushima Daiichi plant disaster, just like we've seen it in 3 Mile Island. Very quickly, Japan had essentially based its whole economy on nuclear energy, provided to them by us. We told them nuclear power is going to be your fast-track way to modernization. And we know that the Japanese economy, of course, took off in the 1960s into a large extent because they did have nuclear power to rely on. And the irony of this was not lost on the Japanese or anybody else. When this disaster happened, there was as reported on an NPR program, there was a spike in people on the internet searching for information of all different kinds. And the word that was typed into the internet search engines more than any other word by far was the word Godzilla. Godzilla had not gone away. If anything, he had become a Hollywood star. He has his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. There are by now at least 65 movies, roughly, made, and Godzilla's had a whole reboot. There's a new one coming out within the next year or so. And if you like Godzilla, you just never have to wait too long. He keeps coming back in various iterations. For Japan, he's kind of a mascot. They regard him as a sort of icon of power and spiritual force and energy. Sort of the soul of Japan is wrapped up in him as a protective dragon, a protective god figure. And sure enough, in the recent movies, it's Godzilla who protects the earth against these, an evil monster, Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, who's an evil god monster. It's this wonderful mythology played out, and it goes back to mythologies of all kinds, back to centuries. A lot of fun. So as we come to a conclusion, I want to go back to our buddy Klaatu, and it's worth remembering his words. I think these apply to the atomic age, the Cold War, the fears we had of aliens attacking us, Russians attacking us, people scaring us from within. And we live with fear still today, I'm afraid, whatever you think of politics. As Klaatu said, I'm fearful when I see people substituting fear for reason. So I like to take his words to heart. And as I come to an end, I must admit to a love for the powerful, scary, empowering image of the atomic bomb. Thank you for hanging there and listening, and I hope